Okay, hands up all those that see a duck. Okay, hands up all those who see a rabbit. Hands up all those who can't see anything who've got the glasses today. What my point is by showing you this particular picture is that one man's duck is another man's rabbit, by which I mean it depends on the way in which you look at things, depends on the way in which you interpret things. Because for those who thought it was a duck, and if I were to start talking about ducks, you'd be very happy. But if on the other hand you thought it was a rabbit and I talked about ducks, you'd think, my God, what's he on? So it's important, therefore, to get some sort of context. But when you get a paradigm and you're asked to shift, as some of you now have had to look at it the other way around, you suddenly think, oh my God, all my preconceptions have changed, everything is different, my goodness me, how come I didn't see it that way in the first place? So changing paradigms, and this in some sense is a paradigm, is always very difficult. But some paradigms actually are very interesting because they have been taken for granted. And here is one, the Cold War. Well, that's a bit of an oxymoron in itself. How can you have a Cold War? I mean, it's either hot or it doesn't exist. Well, actually, of course, it's a very interesting event because it was a standoff. It was a standoff between two military powers, but the war did take place in many, many parts of the world, mostly places like Vietnam, and a war fought quite often by proxies. Yet we accept that this thing called a Cold War did exist, and it existed up and down an Iron Curtain, which again by itself is a bit of a paradigm. Well, of course, now we've left the periods of Cold Wars. We're now into, well, not Cold Wars and not Hot Wars. So I'm going to call them Warm Wars. And the reason I call them Warm Wars is because if you're out there, as my son is right now in Afghanistan, it seems pretty jolly intense, and it seems pretty much like 100% war. If conversely you're sitting here in Nicosia and you've probably just had a few drinks at lunchtime and it's all very calm and collected, it seems an awful long way away. And it's difficult to imagine that people are actually fighting and dying in these places a long way away. So what I want to do is talk about warfare and ask the question, are we at the point where there's going to be a new paradigm? A lot of people are saying that the war, since the end of the Cold War, has changed. The paradigm of the Cold War is now over. We need to get rid of that, get it out of our mindset. Nothing will be the same, everything will be different. So we have to ask the question, is this actually the case? Because here's the next thing I want to make you think about, is that if I told you there was a new paradigm and I produced it like a rabbit out of a hat, this is the new paradigm. Maybe Warm Wars, I don't know. You would then say, at least I hope you would say, but is this the same paradigm that the Taliban use? Because there's a very good chance, gentlemen, that the Taliban's paradigm and our paradigm is not the same. Well, part of the problem with this business is that we need paradigms to explain the complexity of war. And if you see these words coming up, and I'll read you a sentence now, and you see at the point where I stop whether you think you've got the message. For those of us in the front line, we need to have a clear operational strategy to defend our position for our long-term security and for the success of our sweet shop. Now that's gibberish when you think about it. What has happened is these words have been taken by others. Here's another one. The National Health Service hospitals need to have a clear strategy to preserve the front line. What front line? National Health Service isn't on the front line. You don't get a strategy if you're in a health service. These are the words of generals, of generalship, that have been taken up by others and have been misused and adulterated. So the problem is that we can't, therefore, use these words effectively because we tend to misunderstand them, and so we tend to think in paradigms. We tend to think in terms of what is appropriate and what can we naturally use that would actually cover it. The problem with paradigms is that they're a great danger, because if you have a paradigm that is very evocative, then it may make you start to think, well, this is so good, I can extrapolate from this and try and interpret the future according to the paradigm that I've dreamt up. And worse, you can even get to the stage where you think, this paradigm is so good that I will get my equipment program in accordance with this paradigm and I'll recruit in accordance with this paradigm. And to a large extent, the Cold War was on a similar tack. So we need something that will replace what I would describe as classic head-to-head warfare, two armies lined up in front of them, with some sort of novel concept. We need something that's going to give us a meaningful image so that we can understand the strategy, because strategy is difficult, it's not easy. And if you think back in history, how about David and Goliath? David did not take Goliath on head-to-head, he used the indirect approach. And so you can see already we're starting to think we don't have to fight them straight head-on, we can start to use different concepts. Well, of course, the concept you'll be very familiar with from World War II, of course, is blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg, a lightning war, very effective paradigm. This was the way the Germans were going to, well, take over Poland very successfully, take over France very successfully. But then something went wrong when it came to Barbarossa. Here they had convinced themselves that this is what was going to happen in Barbarossa. And of course it did. They drove themselves into the middle of Russia. And the lightning war was going to be so lightning that they wouldn't even need any cold weather kit. But unfortunately it wasn't a lightning war. They got dragged down in the mire and the slush and everything else. And the distances were too fast. But the mindset was there. So this is the damage that you can have. If you have blitzkrieg on your mind and you think it'll always work, well, there's a good chance that it won't. But paradigms actually feed off technology. And so you can see, this arguably was the attack helicopter of its day. And one wonders what sort of paradigm the Egyptians might have had to go to war. And I'd suggest to you that perhaps one of the ones they should have had was that chariots don't tend to float too well, because when you cross the Red Sea it doesn't work as well as you might have thought. But let's just have a look at, I want to look at 5 paradigms that have actually changed the way in which people have thought. And I'm going to start right up here with Pericles and talk about walls and ships and maritime versus continental strategies. And if we look at Pericles, and here's him obviously looking at the Acropolis while it was being made, his concept was this. Athens was too small and too weak to fight Sparta on the plains of Attica. So how are we going to do it? Well, the first option is just to go into the Acropolis, shut it all down and just wait till they have gone, but then you'd starve. So how about this for an idea? We'll protect the Acropolis and the centre of Athens itself, we'll protect Piraeus, as you can see, and we'll create these long walls. And so, of course, what will happen is the Spartans can arrive. They can't manage to knock down the walls, they can't get across the walls, so we are protected, we the Athenians are protected. But how will we then take the war to the enemy? Well, the way the war is taken to the enemy is by ships. So now, instead of meeting them head-to-head in a straightforward denial type of campaign, the idea is to impose costs on the Spartans. So a raiding party goes out to, say, Sparta, raids the town itself, helps itself to whatever it needs, and the costs will then prevent the kings from deciding to continue with this particular form of warfare. So here we have no longer a battle, we have an imposition of costs, which is, of course, coercion. A great strategy, unfortunately, of course, it had one failure, and that was that if you shut people up in a little tiny confined space for a long time, you will probably get the plague, and as you know, Pericles himself actually died of the plague. But he was looked after by his mistress, so at least there's one good thing. The next person I want to turn to is Sun Tzu. And I would say he was writing just a bit before Pericles occurred, but obviously they're never communicated. But I put up there that he was the father of coercion. What you get from Sun Tzu is these bamboo planks or strips upon which pithy maxims are written. And you can see here Paris Hilton is actually reading Sun Tzu, and I wonder if she hasn't done a little bit of coercion herself in her time. So there we have Sun Tzu, father of coercion. He said things like, the supreme importance of war is to attack the enemy's strategy. So we're starting to think rather different from solid tactics again. All warfare is based on deception. And then he went on to say, for to win 100 victories in 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. And what he meant by that is if you get your army and position it in a way that it's pretty obvious to the opposing general that he's going to lose, there is no point in fighting. In which case he will give in and you will have won your battle. So we have Sun Tzu writing about these sorts of ideas, seizing the enemy without fighting, being the most skillful. And this was something that General Giap, after the Vietnamese war, this is what he said, that he read Sun Tzu and he followed him to a great extent. The next person I want to look at is Alexander. Now, a lot of people think that Alexander was a little bit of a maverick, a man who just happened to be dead lucky. He was a gambler who risked everything on the throw of a dice. Actually, I would argue that he didn't. His greatest claim to fame was this. He understood what Clausewitz would have called the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point. And how did he do that? Unlike many of the generals of the era who would set out their armies, and then as the armies then came into collision, the generals had very little control over what took place. This guy always led the companion cavalry, and you can just about see him on a horse there. And his methodology was essentially to move the companion cavalry sideways along the battle line until a gap opened up. And when he saw the gap open up, he would throw his cavalry straight into the gap, and therefore make a bridgehead and then drive on through. Essentially, he was looking for the decisive point. Where can I suddenly apply my force, and where can I exploit the gap that I've created? And as you can see in this particular picture, the battles of Issus and indeed at Gaugamela, there's Alexander going for the strategic gap, and who is on the other side of the strategic gap but Darius. And so by concentrating on what is the decisive point, in this case it's going to be the gap that surrounds or is next to Darius, he was able to drive there. Darius then, as you can see, looks a little bit unhappy and leaves, and of course Alexander has then got himself into the right position. So this is unlike the last two. This is not really so much coercive, this is very much a denial type of strategy, where he's just denying the ability of Darius to employ his forces in the way he would like. But the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point. I want to move on quickly now to have a look at the Romans. And very surprisingly, there's no real corpus of war theory in Rome. I mean, we have Frontinus and Vegetius who write about warfare, but they don't write in a way that's sort of all-encompassing, that tells us how to do a war. Frontinus, for example, gives a lot of historical anecdotes, and if you are the legate, you look through the list of anecdotes and you think, oh, that one will do, and you use that anecdote for that particular event. I mean, one of the things that he points out is Scipio Africanus said this: a road not only ought to be afforded the enemy for flight, but somebody ought to pave it as well. Which is quite a clever thought, because that encapsulates the idea when you are winning a battle. You do not want to create a cornered enemy, because as soon as they're cornered, they'll fight to the last man. What you've got to do is give them an out. And so you not only give them an out, you give a signposted way out so they can run at the earliest possible opportunity. So very clever in that sense. Or if you look at Vegetius, he said, an army is strengthened by labour and enervated by idleness. Valour is superior to numbers. But probably the one that the Romans are best known for is this particular comment. Anyone wants to translate while I have a quick glass of water? If you wish for peace. If you wish for peace, prepare for war. Now, Vegetius is the person that actually codifies it, but a lot of people believe that Augustus said this first, which is why he made sure he had strong legions, because in making sure he had strong legions, he believed he could suppress any possible activity against him. Si vis pacem para bellum. And that is probably the watchword, and indeed, I've used this on a couple of my papers, and I've seen other people do so as well. Well, let's now fast forward, and I want to fast forward to the German, as the Americans sometimes call him, or the dead Karl, which I think is a little bit derogatory. I apologise to Marshal Maurice de Saxe and Frederick the Great that I've missed them out, but I guess that this chap here, was really the first and the greatest theorist of the entirety of war. And you'll recognise some of the things that he said, some of the paradigms that he's given us, because they're now just taken for granted. Who'd like to speculate on the first one I'm going to put up? No one. Okay, there we are. You'll recall that one. War is politics by other means. That's probably his most famous quote. And it's interesting that he was the first person to say it. Why had nobody else said it? It's so obvious. And then he went on to say this: war is an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. That's coercion. You put him in a position where he has to do what you want him to do. Now, he went on to say that if you look at tactics and strategy, tactics teaches the art of a battle. Strategy teaches you how to use the battles to achieve the political end. And many people mistake that. He said tactics, therefore, can be examined mathematically, whereas strategy is an art form. Now, he disagreed completely with this chap here, Jomini. Jomini, and I've given you a quip here, he said it was a science, and if you moved three divisions at 5 kilometres and moved them blah, 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 and probably occupied high ground, then you could see the sort of mathematics that are coming out. And therefore it was guaranteed that if you did X, Y, and Z, you would then win the battle. But of course he didn't then think any more than just tactics and tactics and tactics, and he didn't go beyond that particular point. But Clausewitz went much, much further. And these are some of the things that you will have seen. Everything in war is simple, but the simplest is difficult, blah, 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 because of a kind of friction. And this is true as much for managers today as it is for generals today. If you have a plan that hangs by a thread, the chances are the thread will break, and you will not have a plan, or you certainly won't have a successful plan. So you must anticipate friction. You must anticipate the difficulties. And if you do so, you have a reasonable chance. So that's one of his little things, and I mentioned war is politics. Napoleon and Hitler both followed Clausewitz. But the other ones I want to come on to are these two, centres of gravity and indeed the Schlacht, the idea of a Schlacht. Well, here's one that again is now in common usage. A centre of gravity develops. Doesn't this sound very much like Alexander talking about his decisive point? Except the difference is that Clausewitz meant it both strategically and tactically. So obviously there could be a centre of gravity in a particular tactical engagement. But what he was saying is, if you are the strategist, what do you have to do to gain the centre of gravity and exploit it and therefore defeat the enemy? I mean, popularly it would either have been the king, maybe if you could get control of the king, in Darius for example, or maybe it's the army in the field. If you defeat the army in the field, they'll have no army left. That is the centre of gravity. Then you can do whatever you wish from people with the rest of the force. But he went on, and this is where he disagrees really. This is the Battle of Kursk, by the way. I'm sorry, it didn't come out particularly well in this particular photograph or picture. He disagreed, though, essentially with Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu said, if you can win without fighting, you've done extremely well. Clausewitz said that's a waste of time, because that leaves the enemy army still in existence. According to Clausewitz, there had to be die Schlacht, there had to be a slaughter, because it's only by having the slaughter that you kill the enemy's army. And once they're dead, they stay dead. And so this battle here, Battle of Kursk, he would have fully understood that, when essentially the German armies had the heart taken out of them in the middle of Russia. And of course he would also have agreed very much with things like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You've got to have a final splendiferous ending that brings everything to a final conclusion. So we have sort of, and that's very much a physical thing rather than a psychological thing. But then we have other people who talks about morale. Charles Ardant Dupig. Has anyone here actually heard of him? I'd guess that probably nobody has. He pointed out that the critical thing is having the morale of the army, because unless your army has high morale, even if you have exactly the same armaments, and you go to war with, say, an enemy that is exactly the same with you against you as yourself, if that is the state of play, and you probably exchange shots, and you probably have the same sort of losses, but at the point at which one army gives up, that is the point at which everything changes. That's the point where all the attrition takes place, and suddenly all the losses occur, and of course you give up the field of battle. So he pointed out the value then of morale and the critical importance of attacking the enemy's morale. Thoughts went on a little bit to people like Julio Douay, who was one of the first air power, and as an airman I should mention at least a couple of airmen in this thing. And what Douay said, taking it on from the idea of morale, he said if you attack a city and use some 20 tons of high explosive, incendiaries and gas, and then as the hours pass, all the fires... Whoops, hang on, let's go back. As the hours pass, I'll come back to him in a second. As the hours pass, then of course the poison gas paralyses all life. Eventually the life of the city will be suspended. He wanted to use 500 bombers per day against Constantinople, because he thought using this sort of tactic against Constantinople would guarantee that the porter would no longer be able to operate, and therefore coercive victory would have been gained, and the war would have then been won. I mean, his successor in this sort of idea was probably Harris. But Harris, although he mounted the 1,000-bomber raids which we know about, and although people says he attacked civilian morale, if you actually read what Harris said he attacked, it really wasn't that. He was a man, I'm sorry, you can't read that. He was a man that attacked the war economy. So his view was rather different. He said that if you stop them producing all the essential material for war, it doesn't matter what they want to do. They can't do it. If they haven't got any aeroplanes, if they haven't got any guns, if they have no ammunition. And so that was his purpose. Take out the war effort, and eventually you would win. Well, let me move now forward into more modern things, and I want to obviously move into the nuclear period. And you'll have, those of you who've seen Dr. Strangelove will probably recall Peter Sellers and Buck Turgidson as Sink Sack. And as you can see him saying there, not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I say no more than, well, 10 to 20 million tops. How very easy it is. It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? 10 to 20 million tops. But people thought about this very seriously, and the man who thought about it more than most was Herman Kahn, who wrote his book Thinking About the Unthinkable, and talked about escalation ladders and how it would be possible to win a nuclear war. I mean, a lot of new thoughts came up. Ideas like counterforce. Counterforce meant taking out the enemy's missiles before they hit you. So you can continuously target them, and if you target them first, they can't fire back at you. Or you can have counter value. And counter value means one thing in particular. It means cities. So you have these sorts of concepts. And he said the US could win either by annihilating the enemy, just completely bombing them back to the Dark Ages, or the Stone Ages, I think somebody said, or you can coerce them. You can play this game of how much do you take out, and does that then cause them to surrender? And indeed, if you look at his ladder that he produced, you can see the sorts of ideas. Now, I know you can't read this, but he is saying that this is the escalation that you go through. And if I read you some of the yellow stuff, you'll understand how he sees it. And it was taken seriously, because this is a little computer that people had at the time, which told you, if a nuclear bomb of 3 megatons is dropped 500 yards away from you, blah, 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 and you hide for this period of time, and, all sorts of clever stuff like that, and eventually we win the war. Of course, if you're only 500 yards away from 2 megatons, you wouldn't have a chance, but there you go. But this is the sort of thing it starts with. So this is down at the bottom. We're starting Cold War here. Don't rock the boat. So that's the first thing. Keep everything calm. Keep it under control. The next one is nuclear war is unthinkable. Okay, we're not going to go nuclear. We're just going to keep this down where it is. No one's going to get upset about this. No nuclear use threshold. So we're not going to use nuclears. We're just going to keep it down below nuclear. But as we punch through that one there, then we get on to exemplary local nuclear war. Exemplary local nuclear war. Now, I have to tell you, I have actually sat on a nuclear weapon and have been prepared to go to war, and actually quite a lot of this rings quite true. I can't go into too many details even now. But there we are, exemplary nuclear war. Then we get up to a central sanctuary threshold. That means that whether you attack actually the heartland, the Washington area of America, or do you, to begin with, just attack the areas around, I don't know, New England somewhere, up in Vermont or whatever. So you've gone now from the Vermont attacks, we're now going very rapidly towards the central sanctuary. Then we're central war threshold, and finally city targeting. The gloves now, gentlemen, are off, and it's bye-bye everything, and one's essentially using the ultimate coercive game of poker. And it depends on who can outbluff who, because obviously what was at stake is not just the future of the USA, but the future of mankind. Well, the problem with these sorts of things is that it was based on this concept of mutually assured destruction. Mad. And that's just about what it was. Mad. And you get into a position when you start looking at this, you think, well, is the United States going to be prepared to go to war and use the full panoply of its nuclear capability just because somebody's walked into Berlin? And that was the question that many people asked themselves in the 60s and the early 70s. What stage do you actually go to war? And that's why we then started with another paradigm, the idea of flexible response. And this was the view that we would buy time, we would have a flexible battle, and that would allow time for mature thought, sober thought, and diplomatic activity to try and prevent nuclear war or keep it down. So eventually the problem with this whole strategy, and to some extent this is still there, is that how credible is it? How usable is it? And I think it's quite interesting to recall this stuff when you think Iran is probably on certainly the first step of getting a nuclear weapon. And if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, who knows who may follow. We already know that India has nuclear weapons. According to their own people, North Korea has nuclear weapons. And of course there's a Pakistani weapon with probably about 60 warheads. So these sorts of issues become quite important. You know, where do you use them and how do you use them? Well, we now move from the 60s and through the 70s indeed to this particular chap, Colonel John Warden. And this was the era when the first precision weapons were used, and you can't really see, there's the target there, and you can see it's just hit the bottom of the target and boom, it goes bang. So we're starting to see precision weapons for the time. And to give you an example of the change that this represented, on the 13th of May 1972, right at the end of the Vietnam War, after the Americans had been using, or had tried to use, 800 sorties against the Tan Hoa Bridge in North Vietnam, and failed, the bridge was still there, a flight of, I think the Air Force came in and dropped precision-guided weapons, and the bridge fell down. So 800 unguided weapons failed, and 2 precision-guided weapons succeeded. So this chap, John Warden, said, well, we have to think how it is we can possibly use this capability effectively. What can we do with it that will suddenly give us a new way of looking at conventional warfare? We still have nuclear behind us, but how do we use this conventionally? And he said that thus far, one of the problems we have is that many of the people have been thinking far too tactically. Now, I don't know if I can get this. What we have to now start to address is that we need to think about the strategy. If we're going to use conventional warfare effectively, we need to think like an architect and not, as many people have been doing in the past, like a bricklayer. Because all the bricks in the world piled one on top of the other doesn't make a very good city. You need someone who has the scope, the understanding, the purpose. What are we trying to achieve? And so his view was that now, for the first time, we need to use conventional weapons in a way that looks at the overall picture. But he went on to say, if you look at an enemy state, it's a bit like a dartboard. He said, if you regard, there's the dartboard, the outer ring, as you can see, is the fielded forces, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. The next ring that you come to, in yellow, is the population. Then behind that, of course, you have the infrastructure. And then you have all the processes that support the thing, the links and the banks and the networks and everything else. And then finally, in the middle, you have the leadership. Now, in a Clausewitzian term, he would have said, what is the centre of gravity? Is it the fielded forces? If I defeat the fielded forces, do I then win? Or maybe I have to go and defeat the leader, the Adolf Hitler, or whoever it is, sitting at the centre. But what John Warden said was, this is the difference between ground forces and air forces. Air forces don't have to attack the fielded forces first, they go straight to the leaders. They attack the leaders, they create strategic paralysis, and the enemy can do nothing about it. And what you then do by imposing enough costs is you cause them, realising their strategic paralysis, they give up. And indeed, this was the purpose or the principle that was used in Kosovo. If you think about it, the air war that took place against Serbia through the spring of 1999, I mean, no one did actually invade. No one went through. But we used air power right against the heart of Milosevic's empire, and eventually he was persuaded to give in. The problem is that it doesn't always work, because arguably that's what happened to Hitler. I mean, the bomber force went every day to Berlin, not every day, but lots of days to Berlin, and bombed the hell out of Berlin. And what did Hitler do? Just went deeper in his bunker and closed the doors. So maybe it works, or maybe it doesn't work. But one thing these sorts of thoughts demonstrated was the fact that we are in an era of precision attack. It was extremely useful at the time of Gulf War I and Gulf War II, and it was a very good starting point. But it did demonstrate the fact that we now have a very high technology and a huge form of asymmetry. But there were some downsides. And the first and perhaps the biggest downside of this sort of capability is this. Because we have links that guide all these aircraft with great big real-time communications, politicians then try and become tacticians. And indeed, I remember General Wesley Clark saying on one briefing that I went to that he sat in his office at Shape and actually directed a flight of, I think they were F-16s, to attack 4 tanks. And you think, what is going on? So we have a 4-star commander of all forces in the field directing an attack on some tanks. There's something a bit wrong here. That's not what a 4-star commander does. Which is why you end up with this sort of business. LBJ, they can't even bomb an outhouse in North Vietnam without my approval. But it did demonstrate, this capability did demonstrate very much that it was unprofitable to combat the West face to face. And indeed, as we've said, Gulf War I and indeed Gulf War II demonstrated the dominance very, very clearly. Indeed, I'm sure you'll recall that the Iraqi Air Force, particularly in Gulf War I, were shot down en masse, and they finally decided they would not fight anymore. And early one morning they all lifted off and ran. They didn't run to Syria, they didn't run to Saudi Arabia, they didn't run into Turkey. They ran to Iran, which up until just recently had been their worst enemy, which is a little bit strange. But the paradox then that comes out of this is because we're so good, we no longer have to fight. And indeed, as an airman, I can tell you in Gulf War II, no Iraqi attack aircraft lifted off and fought at all. So they didn't even fight. And the second thing they didn't do is they didn't even take their aircraft and hide them behind mosques or next to hospitals, which is what they did in Gulf War I. What they did was bury them. Now, I don't know how your car likes being buried, but I tell you, most of the aeroplanes I've flown don't enjoy being buried very much at all. At least I don't think I've ever flown an aircraft that has been buried. But there you go, that's what they did to try and get them out of harm's way. So given the fact that we're into this form of conventional superiority, particularly in the air, one has to ask then, what are the options for the underdog? What can the enemy do against this form of overwhelming conventional superiority? Well, I guess the thing to think about is this, that it isn't actually as good as we think. How good is air power against caves? How good is air power against people who live in the drains, in the sewers? How good is air power against vehicles that are underwater? How good is air power in discriminating amongst the mass of population, the thousands of people? And of course the thing is that it isn't that good. So if you're the underdog, you need to think what the options are. Well, let's first of all try and find the West's weaknesses, and to a considerable extent that is what is being done. Find our weaknesses and exploit them. Use camouflage, and I don't mean that by having a net across the top of you. I'm talking about getting in amongst other things that make it difficult for you to use the high technology systems. And instead of thinking about a high-tech war that happens very quickly, how about fighting a long war that goes on for some time? As somebody once said, a great historian asked the Chinese what they thought the effect of Napoleon had been on the history of Europe. And the Chinese, and I can't remember who it was that actually said it, and he said, well, it's far too soon to tell. And so you must expect a war that's going to take place over a long, long period. And that's probably where we are right now. We're down here in this idea of asymmetry. Or as General Sir Rupert Smith has said, we're now in this business of war among the peoples, whatever that might mean. And it's certainly what Osama bin Laden thinks of. And this is the insurgency that we find ourselves in. Well, as you know, a human being is the best computer available. It's the only one that can be produced using unskilled labour. And indeed, if you look at the ability of the suicide bomber, we can't detect him. We can't alter, or seemingly can't alter, his conviction and his delusion. And also, using the global media, he is probably the wonder weapon of the age. So what is the counter then to this particular person? I was going to say gentlemen, but of course it's important to realise that there have probably been as many girl suicide bombers as there probably have been men. Well, the problem is that the more we commit ground troops in to try and organise and control the enemy territory or friendly territory, wherever it might be, the more we are at risk. And so one ends up in a situation that as we commit more people forward, so we end up with more and more targets for the enemy to take on. And this paradox shows that the US is more reluctant than ever, really, to take on these sorts of campaigns. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. Well, we don't start with a clean sheet of paper, unfortunately. And if I showed you, this is from a British perspective, of how our equipment program is going, it'll give you some idea of the sort of duration that each capability will last. So Typhoon is in now, lasts about 2030-ish. Carriers come in, say, 2020, 2050-ish. Trident replacement beyond 2050. That is the same period from 1918 all the way through World War II, Great Depression, Korea, Vietnam. And you think of all the changes that are likely to take place over that sort of duration. How can we possibly predict what is likely to happen in the future? But let me flash up some aircraft and things to remind you. Typhoon and our new air-to-air refueling tanker. The new carriers that are likely to come in, equipped with JSF, the Joint Strike Fighter. All these are subject to review, of course. There's the Joint Strike Fighter in all its glory. The reason this is important is because it's stealthy. And this will be the only aircraft that we will have in the West, apart from what the Americans will have, that can go into a highly hostile environment. Nothing else will penetrate without very significant losses. New frigates. Total number of these so far ordered, 6. Moving on to the ground campaign, things like obviously a C-17 to get A400M to get the new future rapid effect system, which looks a little bit like a tank, which is what the Army are busy buying at present. So these will be deployed in large numbers on aircraft out to trouble spots, obviously helicopters to support them. And one moves on now into the new form of warfare using things like Predator. And this is a picture of Predator, or in its later form, Reaper, which actually has an air-to-ground capability. This perhaps is our suicide bomber of the future. The reason it's a suicide bomber is because it can go in harm's way and we don't mind too much about it. More weapons of the future, all underpinned, of course, by this high technological space and cyber capability that gives us the ability not only to look at bridges in this sort of a degree of granularity, and you can tell exactly what is going on with that particular bridge, a photograph taken, of course, from space, to things like this. This is the British equivalent of J-STARS, the ground surveillance capability. This was actually not taken out of an Astor, this was taken out of a Tornado, out of a Lightning 3 pod, as I've got up there. And you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a video data link taken in March of this year of 4 men digging holes alongside a road. You can see the road there. This was a known route used by British forces. These people started digging at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They were detected by a tornado. They watched them dig, and while they were digging, they thought, well, why would you dig a hole in the middle of nowhere at 3 o'clock in the morning? Well, the answer's pretty obvious. They're laying improvised explosive devices. So very shortly after this, a little platoon came out and surrounded them, and they were taken off, taken away. A further capability you can see here, this is from Raptor, another sensor. I think this is Sheffield, but I don't know. So we can see that we're looking down with a very busy urban environment. We can see lots of people underneath the tree and a vehicle down here. So we know the vehicle left these people and drove down, and we can see there are 2 people in here and there are, 3 people it looks like by the tree. What it doesn't tell you is what they're going to do next. It tells you what they have done, but it doesn't tell you enough about the future. And of course, when we go further forward. Well, let me just talk now about the desired style of warfare that we have then, because I think it's important, before we finish, to look at this. What does the West want to do? Well, it wants to fight remote wars with high technology. It wants them to be high intensity, short duration, so that we don't get our Democrats worried. We want to use relatively few troops with low casualties. That's what we would like to do. But of course, nobody is going to allow us to do that, and it's going to become more and more difficult, because if you look at wars of the future, this is war amongst people. Here are the people. And what we can't afford to do is to end up bombing the wrong person. So we have a B-2 dropping 16 JDAMs. Each JDAM is capable of taking out a target within a metre or 2, fixed target. Each one can go to different, all 16 can go to different aim points. But then if we're not careful, we end up with doing this sort of thing. We end up taking out a lot of innocent civilians, and we end up with the problem of discriminating accurately and not trying to get ourselves into a bit of a fix. Well, let me so the point about discriminating and still having capability for a hot war. Let me turn now, in the final bit, to look at the future world according to the Defence Concepts and Doctrine Centre. And they said that the drivers of the future are going to be these. We're going to end up with a demography, a population that is going to explode. And I know those that have listened to me in the past will have heard me on that. They, in turn, will exacerbate the climate change by placing demands, increasing sea levels, reducing the size of Bangladesh, causing dispossessed minorities who then move as refugees into camps nearby. That, in turn, is, of course, all interpreted by the global media. Then, of course, all these people that live on land and end up as refugees all create demands with the demography on energy and all the other raw materials. And this creates failing states, which are then essentially hijacked by warlords or by people like Osama bin Laden. So one has a difficulty that this whole thing is starting to act in a way that is spiralling out of control. So what can we say about the West then? I think we're going to retain our position of being casualty sensitive, wanting to keep small forces and having, sadly, an antipathetic public. But what about our competitors? Well, arguably our competitors, whoever they may be, are going to think very much the opposite. They probably will be ruthless, and many of them, of course, do not live subject to the rules of law. As far as they're concerned, they don't care about casualties. Indeed, casualties are one of the methods by which they coerce us. They don't really require small forces. In fact, they'll get us whatever size of force they can produce. They're not high technology, and they will try and get their public to be on side. So what sort of paradigms can we see for the future? And I'm going to rush through these a little tiny bit. What are the paradigms that are going to apply? Well, here's one that many people still think has an awful lot of validity: the clash of civilizations. Is this the paradigm for the future? And I'm not going to answer that, but I throw this up. Now, some of you may disagree. I notice Cyprus doesn't even appear on this. You can blame Sam Huntington for this, but nevertheless, is that the paradigm? Clash of civilizations. So warfare will be along the borders, along these borders here, and obviously you can see along the borders there. Is that the paradigm? Or are we, as General Smith has said, in a paradigm of war among the peoples? What sort of warfare are we going to have to fight? Well, I'm not going to spend too long on this. This is the insurgency style of warfare, with IEDs, rockets, and prolonged loss and costs. Is that the sort of war that we're going to have to fight? I don't know. Lots of casualties. I mean, obviously Afghanistan is the classic one we can think of, but we should also think of things like Lebanon in 2006, one stage beyond the Afghanistan type of experience. We shouldn't forget as well the nuclear, biological and chemical aspect to these sorts of things. So that's one possibility of war. The next one to think about is this: is it going to be a proxy war? I mean, Robert Gates has said, and I'll give you his comment here, the US is unlikely to repeat Afghanistan and Iraq. That is, forced regime change, building a nation under fire. Unlikely to do that. That's what he said in June of this year. So that doesn't sound like war amongst the people as far as the United States is perceiving it. And he goes on to say, we will provide them with the equipment, training and other forms of security so they can either fight alongside us or do it by themselves. That sounds to me like proxy warfare, using somebody else to do your fighting for you. And I have to say it didn't work too well when the Romans tried it, because the Visigoths then took Rome itself and helped themselves to all the treasure. But one thing's for sure, other people are doing this. This is, does anyone know what that is? That sort of show. Nope. This is a Chinese K-8 fighter ground attack aircraft. They're selling them across the world, gentlemen, right across the world. Let me tell you some of the people who bought them. Venezuela has just taken delivery of 18. Philippines are probably going to buy it. Indonesia is probably going to buy it. Bolivia has bought it. And this one here has just been delivered to the Zimbabwean Air Force. And you wonder why it is that Zimbabwe need a fighter ground attack aircraft. But there we are. China is selling. China is selling far and wide, right across, as I've said up there, Africa and South America. And we can talk in discussion afterwards about the extent of that. So that's one sort of form of war. The other one I think we ought to think about is a war which is short of war, where we go into cyber warfare, maybe using anti-satellite techniques, maybe using trade, maybe using energy. One thinks of the cyber war that the Russians have just exercised on Estonia to turn down their cyber capabilities. One thinks of the Russians turning off the gas supplies to Europe. But then we can move up a stage and look at maybe a next stage of war, which of course will be more of a state-on-state war, perhaps versus Israel, or perhaps as we got here, lots of scuds fired at an enemy state. Probably not in this case with an aim to destroy the enemy state, but certainly with an aim to getting a result. Sort of state-on-state type of activity, and fair number of casualties, and that of course is going to be the instrument that you use. Why is this chap, for example, buying this sort of capability? This goes out to 600 miles and then fires cruise missiles. At least that's what they say it does. One sometimes wonders why he would need that when he already got intermediate range ballistic missiles and can see the sorts of rings that are given there. So this is the next sort of warfare that is possibly out there and available. Then we ought to ask ourselves, what about this, the most conventional, the most old hat style of warfare, the land grab? Here one's interested not so much in coercing the enemy, but just helping yourself. So of course, this was a classical land grab. Go into Kuwait, help yourself to the oil. State-sponsored, probably a fairly sophisticated enemy. Casualties are not really important there because all you want to do is just take the land and grab it. I mean, the Korean War of the 1950s, the Vietnam War culminated in the fall of Saigon. Georgia, just 2 years ago, would fall into this category. And of course Kuwait in 1990, not forgetting of course as far as the Brits are concerned, the Falkland Islands would fit into this very neatly as well. And then finally we come to the war that we hope will never happen, and this is the high technology all-out war, and I'm not going to say too much, you can make your own views on this. I mean, we would hope that this would never happen, and I've put the Chinese at the top. I'm not suggesting for a second they are going to be the cause of the war, but nevertheless this is the one that is probably the one that we guard against, because ultimately it becomes escalatory. It could then indeed go on to large casualties, and one would end up perhaps in a nuclear exchange. Why do I mention that? I mention that because this is what the Chinese and the Russians, for example, are equipping themselves for. This is PAK-FA T-50. This is the stealth aircraft of Russia. First flight was in January this year. It'll be operational in about 4 or 5 years' time. Russia has ordered 200. The Indians have ordered 200, and they expect to export this aircraft widely because it's cheaper than the F-22. And of course, the first person that almost certainly will be at the top of the list will be China. And then we have things like this, the double-digit SAMs, the S-400, capable of controlling an area up to some 400 kilometres. The S-300, of course, was due to come here to go and sit on Mount Olympus, but it's now, of course, in Crete. Well, this is one stage beyond that, and a very capable weapon it'll be. And the Chinese are developing a concept known as area denial, so using the Russian PAK-FA and things like the J-10, their aim is to guarantee that no foreign power can actually go into an area. Because by using their great long-range surface-to-air missiles, by using their stealthy aircraft, they guarantee that they will inflict a terrible attrition. And if that isn't bad enough, the latest thing that they're working on is using intermediate-range ballistic missiles as part and parcel of that capability. That would be used against troops in the field, against air bases, and against any other vital targets such as headquarters. But here's the clever bit. On top of that, on certain derivatives, is a tracking device, and a tracking device that can track things like carriers. It goes out to 1,500 miles, and I know that it's causing considerable heartache in the Pentagon right now, because with the sort of capabilities that I have shown, China, and indeed Russia, could have this sort of capability, and essentially deny airspace and ground space to anybody who wanted to go in there. And the only thing you could use against that would be something that was very, very stealthy. And of course, we shouldn't forget there is also always the nuclear problem as well. Well, let me just wrap up by talking then about the enemy paradigms, because I think it's important that we try in this concept, and I've gone through an awful lot of paradigms, an awful lot of ways of looking at the war, but the critical thing is to think, what might my enemy do? Because you can have the best paradigm in the world, and if it doesn't match up to what the enemy is likely to do, it's probably the worst paradigm in the world. So what are the enemy's possible paradigms? Well, jihad, of course, using a combination of media and violence. And I would suggest that Taliban right now are using the media a hell of a lot better than we in the West are using it. Very good coercive method of getting the end state that you want. How about the controlling aspect? So we use gas supplies and cyber. I don't know quite what the Russians might call this sort of style of warfare, gentle coercion, and coercion short of war, but using coercion in a way that gains the sort of results that you want. Can all be portrayed as being very, very defensive. And then, of course, we come on to one that has always been a casus belli, this idea of restoring rights or supporting the dispossessed. You know, Argentina would say, we had the Falklands first, it's ours. Well, they're ours. Fine, okay, that's a good casus belli. But that's nevertheless, it's going to be one that's going to go on. Taiwan springs to mind. And there are many other locations, Spratlys, Paracels, for example. So this is ours, and we're going to take it. We're going to use diplomacy, media, and ultimately we'll even invade. So perhaps that's the paradigm we need to think about. Are these the paradigms that apply? Because although I've given you 5 different possible scenarios for warfare, each one of these paradigms, the jihad could be used, for example, not just for insurgency, but for total global nuclear war, if you wanted. So you have to work out what it is that the enemy is thinking and try and understand. And similarly, of course, this could be used in the most isolated and localized form of warfare. So I would suggest that the role of people right now is to try and distinguish whether the paradigms that you're applying are contextual. Is this a clash of civilizations that we're actually involved in? Is that the context in which we currently operate? But then think, what is the purpose? Are we actually in ethnic cleansing? Is that the purpose of what it is we're doing? Let's think back to the Kosovo example. Or we can think on to the means. What means are we using? And that brings us on to blitzkrieg. So we have paradigms that fit the context, the purpose, and indeed the means. And we've got to ask ourselves just which ones would apply and how they fit. Not forgetting, of course, that all the way through, everything that we are doing is going to be mediated through this little group of people, our dear old friends in the media, because they will exploit the horrors of war and use it in a way that may be beneficial or may be highly adversarial, highly detrimental. So my thoughts to leave you with are these. If you are keen to understand how warfare of the future will develop, you don't need to worry quite so much about our own paradigm, whether our paradigms have changed, whether we have more paradigms, fewer paradigms, whether we have a new paradigm or an old paradigm. The critical one is to understand the enemy's paradigm, the adversary's paradigm. Understand what it is he thinks he's doing, because if you can understand that, then you may be able to negotiate with him. But if you can't negotiate, then hopefully you can find his weaknesses, and maybe you could even just turn it to your advantage. So what is it? Is it a rabbit? Or is it indeed, as you can see there, a duck? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.